The Persian Gulf shimmered under the pre-dawn darkness as Commander Jake "Reaper" Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, studying the tactical display with growing unease. Red contacts were multiplying along the Iranian coastline like a spreading infection. For the past 2 hours, Iranian missile boats had been moving into position, and now they formed a perfect attack pattern. Morrison had been Air Wing Commander for 3 years, flown combat missions over 3 continents, but he'd never seen anything like this. The Ford was leading a 3-carrier strike group conducting operations against Iranian military targets. For weeks, tensions had escalated after Iran's devastating missile attacks on Israeli cities killed hundreds of civilians. The United States had joined Israel in striking back hard, and now Iran had vowed revenge. Captain Sarah Chun stood beside Morrison, her face illuminated by the red glow of threat indicators. "They're really going to do it," she said quietly. "After everything we hit last week, they're going for broke." Morrison nodded grimly. The intelligence had been clear. Iran was preparing something big. The tactical display showed their position with brutal clarity. The Ford was operating in the northern Persian Gulf, with the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower positioned 40 miles to the south and the USS Harry S. Truman another 35 miles beyond that. Destroyer and cruiser escorts formed protective rings around each carrier. But those red contacts made Morrison's blood run cold. Dozens of Iranian missile boats and mobile launchers were positioning themselves with military precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered all 3 carriers. "Iranian coastal defense batteries are going active," the tactical officer announced. Multiple radar emissions detected across the entire coastline. Chen picked up the handset to contact the other carriers. "This is Ford Actual to all commands. Threat level is now critical. All ships to battle stations. Prepare for imminent attack." Klaxons began wailing throughout the massive carrier. Morrison could hear boots pounding on steel decks as 5,000 sailors rushed to their combat positions. The ship transformed from a floating city into a weapon of war in minutes. Morrison grabbed his flight helmet. "I'm getting airborne," he told Chen. "We need eyes up there." Morrison sprinted through the narrow passageways toward the flight deck, his boots echoing against steel. Sailors pressed themselves against the walls to let him pass, their faces tight with fear and determination. They all knew what was coming. The night air hit him like a furnace as he burst onto the flight deck. Even at this hour, the Gulf heat was oppressive. Around him, organized chaos reigned as yellow-shirt aircraft handlers guided F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning IIs into launch positions. Red-shirt ordnance crews were loading missiles and bombs with frantic precision. Lieutenant Commander Maria "Viper" Rodriguez was already in her cockpit, running pre-flight checks. She was Morrison's deputy and the best pilot he'd ever flown with. Through her canopy, Morrison could see her making hand signals. "Hurry up." Morrison reached his own F divided by a -18E Super Hornet. The plane captain had her ready, weapons loaded, fuel tanks topped off. Morrison climbed the ladder and strapped himself in, his hands moving over switches and instruments with practiced efficiency. The canopy lowered with a hydraulicus, sealing him in. He powered up the systems, watching screens flicker to life. His radar showed the fleet around him and those red hostile contacts beyond, waiting like predators. "Tower, this is Reaper. Request immediate launch clearance," Morrison said into his radio. "Reaper, you're cleared. Cat 1 is ready. Good hunting." Morrison taxied forward, feeling the Hornet's power thrumming through the airframe. The catapult officer gave him the signal, and Morrison pushed his throttles to full power. The engines roared behind him, shaking the entire aircraft. He saluted, signaling his readiness. The catapult fired with a blast of steam, and Morrison was slammed back into his seat as the massive carrier hurled him into the air. 0 to 170 miles per hour in 2 seconds. The ocean rushed up beneath him, then fell away as he climbed. Morrison retracted his landing gear and banked hard, watching as Viper launched behind him. One after another, aircraft shot off the Ford's deck, climbing into the dark sky to form a defensive screen. "All fighters, this is Reaper. Form up on me. We're establishing a defensive perimeter at Angels 20. Morrison climbed to 20,000 feet, his radar sweeping the sky and sea below. More aircraft were launching from the Eisenhower and Truman now. Dozens of fighters scrambling to protect the fleet. Below, the three carriers looked small and vulnerable, gray ships on dark water. Morrison had spent 15 years in the Navy, and he'd always believed carriers were untouchable. They were floating fortresses, protected by layers of defenses that made them nearly invincible. But looking at those Iranian contacts on his display, Morrison felt doubt creeping in for the first time. The Iranians had been preparing for this moment for decades. They'd purchased advanced anti-ship missiles from Russia and China, reverse-engineered others, and developed sophisticated tactics specifically designed to kill American carriers. They'd studied the Ford-class carriers' vulnerabilities, their radar signatures, their defensive capabilities. And now, with three carriers grouped in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, the Iranians had their perfect opportunity. Reaper, I've got multiple airborne contacts launching from Iranian bases. Viper's voice crackled through his headset. Looks like they're sending everything they have. Morrison checked his display. Dozens of new contacts were appearing. Iranian aircraft taking off from bases across the country. F-4 Phantoms, F-14 Tomcats, even some newer Russian-made Sukhois. All of them were heading toward the American fleet. Copy that, Viper. Stay sharp. This is going to get ugly fast. Morrison's radar warning receiver suddenly screamed to life. Missile launch. Multiple missile launches detected. The call came from an E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft orbiting high above the fleet. Morrison's blood turned to ice as his display lit up with red tracks. Dozens of them emerging from the Iranian coast and from the missile boats that had been waiting in ambush. Ballistic missiles were arcing high into the atmosphere before plunging down toward their targets. Sea-skimming cruise missiles were racing just above the wave tops at supersonic speeds. The Iranians had launched everything at once, a massive saturation attack designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. All ships, weapons free. Engage all hostile contacts. Captain Chen's voice rang out across the tactical net. Below, the Aegis destroyers and cruisers opened fire immediately. SM-3 and SM-6 interceptor missiles streaked upward from their vertical launch cells, their contrails drawing white lines across the dawn sky. The destroyers' advanced computers could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously, but there were so many incoming missiles. Too many. Morrison watched the intercepts happening in real time on his display. American missiles were finding their targets, destroying Iranian weapons in mid-flight. Explosions blossomed in the sky like deadly flowers. But the Iranians had planned for this. They'd studied American carrier defenses for years, running simulations and war games. They knew exactly how many missiles it would take to overwhelm the defensive screen, and they'd launched twice that number. Reaper, I'm engaging. Viper called out. She'd spotted Iranian F-4 Phantom fighters escorting the missile strike, old American-made aircraft loaded with anti-ship missiles. Morrison saw them now on his radar, 8 contacts moving to intercept the American defensive screen. All fighters, weapons free. Engage enemy aircraft. Morrison rolled his Hornet toward the nearest F-4, his finger finding the weapon select switch. He chose an AIM-120 AMRAAM, their longest-range air-to-air missile. The targeting computer locked on, and Morrison fired. The missile dropped from his wing and ignited, accelerating to Mach 4 as it raced toward the enemy fighter. The AMRAAM tracked perfectly. Morrison watched on his radar as the missile closed the distance in seconds and detonated. The F-4 disappeared from his screen. Splash 1. Morrison called out. But there was no time to celebrate. More Iranian aircraft were pushing through, and below, the first ballistic missiles were reaching their terminal phase, plunging down toward the fleet at incredible speeds. Morrison looked down and saw the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower maneuvering hard, zigzagging through the water at over 30 knots. Her escorts had formed a tight ring around her, their missile launchers firing continuously. The sky around the Eisenhower was filled with interceptors and countermeasures. a desperate shield of technology trying to stop the onslaught. But it wasn't enough. Morrison watched in horror as a Khalij-Fars anti-ship ballistic missile punched through the defensive screen. It struck the Eisenhower's flight deck with the force of a small earthquake, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. A massive fireball erupted from the carrier's midsection. Even from 20,000 feet up, Morrison could see the devastating damage. The explosion tore a hole in the flight deck the size of a house. Secondary explosions rippled through the hull as aviation fuel and ordnance cooked off. "Ike is hit. Ike is hit." The radio filled with frantic calls. Morrison's heart sank as he watched smoke pour from multiple holes in the carrier's deck. Aircraft that had been preparing to launch were thrown into the sea by the blast. Sailors were running across the damaged deck, fighting fires and trying to save their ship. Then another missile hit the Eisenhower, this one striking near the island superstructure. The second explosion was even more devastating than the first. Morrison could see it clearly. A massive detonation that tore through the Eisenhower's command center and bridge. The carrier's island structure, which housed all her command and control systems, was engulfed in flames. Captain Chen's voice came over the radio, tight with emotion. "All aircraft, this is Ford Actual. Eisenhower has lost command and control. She's going down. All her aircraft are to divert to Ford or Truman immediately. Going down." An American supercarrier, one of the most powerful warships ever built, was sinking. Morrison had never imagined he'd see this day. The Eisenhower began to list to port as water flooded into her hull through the massive holes torn by the missile impacts. Her damage control systems were overwhelmed. Morrison watched as the list increased to 20 degrees, then 30. The carrier was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to save her. Sailors were abandoning ship now, jumping from the tilted deck into the churning water below. Escort vessels moved in to begin rescue operations, but they were still under attack themselves. Iranian missiles were still incoming, and the destroyers couldn't break off to help without leaving the remaining carriers vulnerable. Morrison forced himself to focus. He still had a job to do. More Iranian aircraft were pushing through the defensive screen, and he had to protect the Ford and Truman. He selected another target, an F-4 Phantom loaded with C-802 anti-ship missiles, and fired his second AMRAAM. The missile tracked true, destroying the Iranian fighter before it could launch its payload. "Good kill, Reaper," someone called out. But even as Morrison fought, he kept glancing at the tactical display. The USS Harry S. Truman was under attack now, multiple missiles converging on her position from different vectors. Her Aegis escorts were firing everything they had, their vertical launch cells emptying rapidly. Morrison counted at least 15 incoming missiles heading for the Truman. Her defenses were good, but not that good. He watched helplessly as 3 missiles penetrated the defensive screen in rapid succession. The first struck the Truman's bow, exploding just above the waterline. The second hit her flight deck amidships. The third slammed into her stern near the propulsion systems. All 3 detonated within seconds of each other. The Truman shuddered under the impacts, but kept moving. She was tougher than the Eisenhower, or perhaps luckier. The missiles had hit her at less critical points. Truman reports major fires on the flight deck and hangar bay. The tactical net announced. She's maintaining way, but has lost all aircraft launch capability. Damage control teams are fighting to save the ship. Morrison felt a wave of despair wash over him. 2 carriers effectively out of action within minutes. The Eisenhower was capsizing, her red bottom now visible as she rolled over. The Truman was crippled, unable to launch or recover aircraft. That left only the Ford still operational, and every Iranian missile that remained was being directed at her. Morrison looked down at his ship. She was maneuvering hard, her captain throwing her into violent turns to throw off incoming missiles. Her escorts had closed in tight, forming a last-ditch defensive ring. The sky around the Ford was filled with interceptors and countermeasures. Morrison could see SM-6 missiles launching continuously, racing to intercept the Iranian weapons before they could reach the carrier. But there were so many missiles. The Iranians had planned this perfectly, timing their attack to hit all three carriers simultaneously, forcing the defensive systems to split their attention. "Reaper, I'm Winchester," Viper called out. Winchester meant she was out of missiles, down to just her cannon. Several other pilots reported the same. The intensity of the engagement had burned through their weapons loads in less than 30 minutes. "All Winchester aircraft return to the boat for rearm," Morrison ordered. But even as he said it, he wondered if the Ford would still be there when they arrived. He watched his tactical display as another wave of missiles approached. The Ford's escorts were doing everything they could, but their magazines were running low. They'd been firing continuously for 20 minutes, and even the most advanced ships in the world had limits. Morrison saw it happen in slow motion. A Zolfagar cruise missile, flying at Mach 2 just above the wavetops, evaded the outer defensive ring. It skimmed past the destroyer, its radar cross-section too small to track effectively. The Ford's close-in weapon systems opened fire, phalanx guns spewing thousands of rounds per second. But the missile was too fast, too close. It struck the Ford's port side near the waterline. The explosion was massive. Morrison felt it in his gut even from miles away. The carrier shuddered, and he could see a fireball erupt from her hull. Smoke poured from the impact point. "Ford is hit. We've got flooding in compartments 3 to 145 through 3 to 160. The damage control reports flooded the radio. Morrison's hands tightened on his stick. That was his ship down there, his home. His brothers and sisters were fighting for their lives. But the Ford's crew was well trained. Within seconds, damage control teams were responding, sealing bulkheads and fighting the flooding. The carrier maintained her course and speed, still maneuvering to evade incoming threats. Morrison had 3 missiles left, 3 chances to make a difference in this nightmare. He spotted an Iranian P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft orbiting at the edge of the battle, about 80 miles from the fleet. It was coordinating the attack, feeding targeting data to the missile boats and coastal batteries. If Morrison could take it out, he might disrupt the Iranian kill chain and buy the fleet precious time. He turned hard toward the P-3, pushing his throttles to afterburner. His Hornet leaped forward, accelerating through Mach 1. The sonic boom rippled across the sky below him. "Reaper, where are you going?" Viper called out, taking out their command and control. "Cover the fleet." Morrison's radar warning receiver started chirping. The P-3's escorts had spotted him. 2 Iranian F-14 Tomcats, ancient American-made fighters that Iran had somehow kept flying through decades of sanctions, were turning to intercept. These were Iran's best fighters, and the pilots flying them were likely among their most experienced. Morrison was committed now. He couldn't turn back. Morrison fired 1 AMRAAM at the lead F-14, forcing the Iranian pilot defensive. The F-14 broke hard left, dispensing chaff and flares. Morrison's missile tracked through the countermeasures and detonated close enough to damage the fighter's wing. The F-14 limped away, trailing smoke. But the second F-14 was still coming, and Morrison was now within range. He pressed on toward the P-3, which was trying to run, turning away and diving. But the lumbering patrol aircraft was too slow. Morrison's targeting computer achieved lock, and he fired his second-to-last missile. The AMRAAM tracked perfectly across the 40 miles separating them. It struck the P-3's fuselage and detonated. The aircraft disintegrated, debris tumbling toward the Gulf below. "Reaper, good kill," someone called out. But Morrison's celebration was short-lived. The second F-14 had closed the distance and was now on his 6 o'clock. His radar warning receiver screamed as the Iranian pilot locked him up with a Phoenix missile, a massive long-range weapon that the U.S. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, and share to keep a veteran going.